All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Skills-Based Health on Demand, brought to you today by DESE, Missouri Healthy Schools, and then MOSHAPE. We are here today to bring you some instructional strategies that you can use to teach our national health education standards, or these skills. And so we're going to start today with scenarios and prompts, and I am Kim Goforth. I am the Health and PE Coordinator up at the Columbia Public Schools, and I am joined with the world famous Brad Brummel. So good morning, Brad.
Good morning. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, doing good.
Let's jump right in, Kim.
All right, sounds good. Today, like I said, we're going to look at using the instructional strategies, scenarios, and prompts. And our learning objective today is to have you guys, as the viewer, plan a learning activity that uses these scenarios and prompts to practice one of these health skills. And like I had mentioned, that they partner with our new national health standards. And so we're going to jump right in. And as a guide for you to work with us today, we've prepared a training guide, and this is the beginning of it so you can see for reference. And to access this training guide, there is a link in the YouTube description. You can either download that, there are some fillable boxes for you to type in, or if you're old school printer version like myself, and you can write on those, that is available as well. I will tell you, if you do print, there are some links that you might want to access, and so have that handy by your computer as well. So let's jump in and talk about standards or scenarios and prompts. And so Brad, talk us through a little bit of the why this is a good instructional strategy to use to teach our new health standards.
Yeah, here's just a couple of, I think, bullets that speak to the why. I think most importantly, it allows our students to practice thinking and applying that health skill outside of the classroom setting, because it's so hard for us as health educators to assess outside of the classroom setting for obvious reasons. But we can invite students into the thought process of applying that skill outside of the classroom setting while they're in our space. And so, and it also creates the opportunity for these scenarios and prompts to be culturally responsive. It also makes it very simple for a teacher to be able to differentiate for different groups of students, with changing the scenarios, changing the language, changing the application. And then the other great thing is, as we go into all 6 of the instructional strategies through this series, you'll probably see scenarios and prompts in multiple other areas. And so it's a great strategy to become well-versed in and confident in, because you'll use it combined with other teaching strategies. And it's one of our go-tos here in Springfield.
Same here in Columbia. Very good. So Brad mentioned several of the good whys. And I always think when I was in the classroom and I was prepping for scenario writing, I used to think back to, as you're teaching and in your life, or just in your personal experiences in life, I think sometimes as teachers we say, oh man, that was a teachable moment that you wanted to kind of catch kids in. And so I used to think to myself, man, I should write that situation down so I could make that a scenario. And so kind of get in that practice, as you're engaging with different things in life where you think, boy, that'd be a great teachable moment for my kids. Jot that down and make a scenario out of it. So that's one tip and trick that's not listed on here, but it's kind of prompts your thinking, as you're experiencing life. Here's some other tips and tricks for using these scenarios. Keep them short and simple, especially for those younger grades. And for those younger grades, if reading is going to be difficult, or maybe language is a barrier, use some images that you can also partner with some of the language for your scenario. One big one is this third one. Brad mentioned that a really positive why of using scenarios is to be culturally sensitive and aware, but be real careful of bias and stereotypes within your scenarios. It has to feel good and make sense to your entire class. And I remember I taught in bigger school districts, but I grew up in a smaller town. And I remember one scenario I mentioned something about, it was during the drug and alcohol unit, and we talked a little bit about cruising town. I used the language cruising town. And my big school district that I was teaching in was like, I'm not quite familiar what you mean. And I'm like, down to Sonic, out to Bucks, down to Sonic, out to Bucks. And that's all we did all night. And they're like, no idea what you're talking about. So if that scenario didn't make sense to them, which it didn't, was hard to explain. And so be aware of some of the language that you use. Just be aware of that kind of thing. Don't get caught in that small town situation. And then use different levels of scenarios, scaffold the reading levels. There's a lot of programs now that you can change some of the language and make it different grade levels and things like that. Brad mentioned pairing with other teaching strategies, which we will mention some of those later in our series. And then let students write their own scenarios. If you're having trouble, they bring some life experiences that we can use and learn from each other. They can learn from their peers as well. I would review those. I'd be a little cautious. You don't want to get too detailed with their stories if it's a little bit, if it's a borderline unsafe, maybe practices that are going on in their homes and things like that. So they can create them. It can save you some time and they can learn from each other, but revise, review, and edit those as well. So those are some tips and tricks for scenarios. Brad, talk about the prompts end of this instructional strategy.
Yeah, so I think one common mistake that we can make is that we spend a lot of time on the scenario, but then our prompts are just whatever comes to mind first. And we want to be just as intentional and put just as much thought into the prompt as the scenario. And one of the ways you can do that is to really pay attention to the verb, just like you would when intentionally planning a lesson with an outcome or a standard. We want to do the same thing with our prompt. And so if you find the verb with your learning objective or the standard, you want to make sure that's aligned to the verb within your prompt. And that's just one tip that can really help you make sure you maximize the impact of your scenario and prompt. So for 2 examples here, pretty simple, but if the learning objective is to analyze, we can't just have the students answer yes or no. And if the expectation is that in example 2, we want our students to be able to determine the difference, we should be having the students choose something. And so those are just 2 examples of how to be intentional with the verb within the prompt and the learning objective.
Very important. Can be used as an assessment too. That'd be helpful to be on verb level. So, all right, Brett and I have shared some of the whys and some tips and tricks for using scenarios and prompts. And so we're going to give you a minute as our opening activity to maybe capture your aha moment, something that really spoke to you during this conversation. And on page 1 of your training guide, jot down some of your takeaways from either the whys or the tips and tricks. You can pause the video if you would like, but then answer that on page 1. And then we are going to jump into probably the favorite part of this instructional strategy series that we're going to work through is let's practice. Let's model through how to use an instructional strategy to teach these skills, these health skills. So we're going to work today with Standard 5. And Standard 5 is about decision making. And so students will demonstrate the ability to use decision making skills to enhance health. If we want to further narrow our focus here, we're going to look at performance indicator 5.8.6, which is a 6-8 grade span performance indicator, talking about choosing healthy alternatives over unhealthy alternatives when making a decision. And so if those are our outcomes, Brad, model through how we would use this strategy to target this performance indicator.
Yeah, so first I would want to make sure that I am paying attention to some of the sub skills that my students are going to need to master or practice in order to become confident in that skill, especially the important skill of being able to choose a healthy alternative over an unhealthy alternative. And so I love using the RMC teaching progressions and their health skill guides. Love the vocab that's provided, and the guiding questions can be super helpful when even creating those scenarios and prompts. And it's always great to lead classroom discussion, but I have found those guiding questions helpful when kind of brainstorming and creating those scenarios and prompts as well. And so what we're going to do with this standard and practice opportunity is just show you an example of how you could provide this practice opportunities for students. And so here's an example scenario. We're putting the student in a situation where they hurt their ankle last night being active on a trampoline. And the scenario that they're in is that they wake up the next morning and their ankle is swollen, blue and purple, and it's game night, and your parents are both at work. And so we want to have students use the same steps that were probably taught prior to this practice opportunity. These are the 5 steps that are involved with decision making. And so we would first want students to be able to determine the importance of the decision. Do you need help? And so now you can see the questions in the prompts box. Do we need help? So that's helping us practice step 1, determining if this is the importance of this decision. How soon should you act? So now we're again continuing to decide how important is this decision, and now we're starting to prioritize a strategy. So what are your options? What are the consequences involved? Who is available to help? And so now we are getting into that healthy and unhealthy alternatives with the consequences. And then as we're reflecting on who is available to help and how will you communicate, that was the sub-skill, which was communicate decisions. And so if we go back one step, you can see that one of the sub-skills was communicate decisions. And so that's why we have that included, even though you don't see that directly in the standard choose healthy alternatives over unhealthy alternatives when making a decision. We included that as a prompt because we know it's a sub-skill within this step. And so that's why we've included that in this prompt. And we would ask that our students use a decision-making model. And so these are typically helpful when going through a decision-making scenario or prompt. And so we're using the decide model, and students would use this to kind of go through those prompt questions, and they would just use the step-by-step going through that. And then we would finish with a reflection opportunity. And we want to make sure we do this because we notice that step 5 is reflect on our 5 steps of decision making. Not only is reflection always important, but we know that it's part of our 5 steps. And so you can see that we have some reflection prompts here. After weighing my options, I have decided to blank because blank. So not only are we giving students the opportunity to reflect, but we're also giving them the language. And one thing I love about the RMC Health Skill Guides is they provide language of health literacy with each suggested learning activity. And so we pulled this first bullet straight from that health language in the RMC Health Skill Guide because you can use those for helpful prompts. And then we're asking, does this decision impact others? And why is it important to make decisions? Just to kind of have a powerful reflection there as we are learning about decisions.
Great.
So Kim, did you have anything you wanted to add to that practice opportunity before we move on?
I think that it's a great model of how all of those steps in that teaching progression happened with just using scenarios and prompts. And like you said, it's pretty heavy when you read just the standard or the performance indicator. And so you miss little things like you mentioned in those sub-steps. And I think that for educators that maybe are moving to maybe standards-based models and assessment and things like that, I think you can use each of those sub-skills as maybe some formative assessments to work your way up to some of the bigger standard language. And so I think that this example that you put out really captures all of that. So nicely done as using scenarios and prompts because it's so powerful. So great job. Now, we're going to give you viewers a chance to kind of process through maybe a different standard that you want to focus on and your grade span. And so take a minute to get to your training guide in the practice section of part 1. And this number 1 is just talking about what you want to focus on. So maybe pick a standard that is maybe a high need in your particular district or space, and jot that down on part 1, number 1. And then just like Brad has kind of modeled through, how will you start to design your lessons? How will you look at that instructional planning, maybe dig into some of the steps that are in the RMC training guides, and then maybe sketch out your plan of a scenario or jot down some prompt questions that you may have to tie back to the verb that is in the standard that you have selected. So take a minute there and process through a lesson or a learning activity that you would put your kids through, just like Brad had demonstrated here for us. And then once you get done with that, as an overall scenarios and prompts reflection. And so we see a lot of times in all of our health skills that we need to give students time to reflect. And so we have set up a little space here for you as the viewer to reflect. And how can you find these teachable moments via scenarios and prompts, and think about it as a global learning activity here. And so as you've created something, what makes you excited about digging into that and presenting that to your students? And then what challenges may you experience, and kind of get ahead of some of those things and be thoughtful as you go to implement some of these strategies using our new health education standards. So take some time to reflect there in your training guide. And we thank you so much for joining us to talk about scenarios and prompts today. And we want to remind you that there are some other skills-based health on-demand sessions. We are here where the red arrow is. We have some other videos available for instructional strategies. We also have a why of skills-based health education. That's one separate video. Another one is making the shift to this skills-based health education. And then we have each national health standard video that kind of digs into each one individually. So we hope you access some of these videos and join Brad and I for another discussion on skills-based health education. So thanks for joining us today. And Brad, as always, thank you for all of your good wisdom on skills-based health.
Thanks for joining us.
Bye, everybody.